Oh, so this is So They Won't Forget Part 2. And those of you that were not on last week, we talked about the situation that was revealed in Judges chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. And to review that, we looked at Joshua's generation. Joshua and his contemporaries, the elders that were with him, and we looked at the fact that Joshua's generation had every reason to pass on faith. We listed 10 different benefits or advantages that generation had in a spiritual sense. In fact, when you look at the times in Scripture where there were absolute miracles that were performed by our Lord and by our God for the favor of mankind, there was certainly a lot during the time of Moses, and some in Joshua, and then there were many during the time of Elijah and Elisha, and then of course the time of Jesus. But in between, there weren't a lot of miracles that we read about in Scripture. And this was one of the generations that had all of those miracles that they saw God do, just supernatural things that had happened. And you would think that would really solidify their faith very, very strongly. But then we saw that just 2 generations later, Israel did not know God or his works. And it causes us to say, well, what happened? What happened in those 2 generations? How did they fall so quickly from being in such an advantaged position spiritually to not even knowing God or his works? And so when we looked at that, we looked at these verses right here. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And I think that this is actually describing 3 generations here. The first one is the one that's underlined. That whole generation would be the one that was the contemporaries of Joshua. And it says about them that they both knew the Lord and they saw what God had done. They both knew him, excuse me, and they saw him. And then the third generation, it says about them that they neither knew the Lord. Another generation grew up. After they had all died, another generation grew up. And I think that's talking about grandchildren, because it would be worded a little differently if it were just children. So then we look at the 3 generations here. We have the first generation that we're looking at that knew and saw. I think there was that second generation that heard about what God had done from their parents, but they didn't have a front row seat to all of the miracles. They heard about them, but they hadn't actually seen them themselves. And then we have that third generation that neither knew nor saw what God had done. So that's what we talked about last time. And we ended by saying, so where's the answer? What's the solution? And it's not found in the book of Judges. To click to make it show up for you. Okay, all right. Now we're back, and it was sure important to get that up on the screen. So Psalm 78, I see this as a psalm that was written to prevent future generations from not knowing and not seeing. And the psalm was written by Asaph. Asaph was David's chief musician. He wrote 13 psalms. He wrote Psalm 50, and then the psalms from 73 through 83. So this one's kind of in the middle of that second one. And I believe that he wrote it so that that history wouldn't repeat itself. Remember, he's a musician. He was writing songs for the nation of Israel. And I just can imagine, this is just my imagination running, but I can just imagine that he came across a scroll of the Judges, and he was reading through the Judges, and he had the same reaction we had. He got to that passage that in our Bibles is chapter 2, and he said, how could this have happened? How could they have walked away so quickly? And I can just imagine that he wrote this psalm as a way to say, it isn't going to happen in our generation. I'm going to do everything I can to break that pattern that was going on during the time of the Judges. I'm going to try to stop that. And I think we'll see that as we look at it together. But I just imagine that that was the motivation for Asaph as he was writing. Now, I'm going to do something really different than what we normally do on Monday nights, and that is I'm going to read the whole chapter. You're going to have to be patient with me, but I think it's really important for us to get a sense for the whole chapter. There are 72 verses in this chapter, so it's going to take us a few minutes. But as we go through, I want you to notice that when we get to chapter 12, he starts talking about Israel in the wilderness. And then in verse 42, he goes backwards to Egypt and the things that happened there. And then in verse 59, he fast forward to the children of Israel in the land of Canaan after they had conquered the land. Now, verses 9 through 11 are a mystery to scholars. They're not real sure what they are referring to as in the history of Israel. So we're just going to leave it that way right now. But let's begin by reading through the whole psalm together. I'm going to make just a couple comments, but for the most part, I'm just going to read it straight through. Here's how it starts. My people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. And it's interesting. This is the only psalm that begins with a phrase like this. He's saying, look, everybody, listen up. That's how he starts out here. And again, it's the only psalm that begins that way. He says, I will open my mouth with a parable. Remember, a parable is a story. In this case, it's a true story about the history of the nation of Israel. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation. And here are the verses and the parts of the verse that we quote so often. We will not hide the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his powers, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. Does that sound like the opposite of Judges chapter 2? And they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. The men of Ephraim, though armed with bows, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wonders he had shown them. He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall. He guided them with a cloud by day and with light from the fire all night. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. But they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High. They willingly put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God. They said, can God really spread a table in the wilderness? True, he struck the rock and water gushed out, streams flowed abundantly. But can he also give us bread? Can he supply meat for his people? When the Lord heard them, he was furious. His fire broke out against Jacob and his wrath against Israel. For they did not believe in God or trust in his deliverance. Yet he gave a command to the skies above and opened the doors of the heavens. He rained down manna for the people to eat. He gave them the grain of heaven. Human beings ate the bread of angels. He sent them all the food they could eat. He let loose the east wind from the heavens, and by his power made the south wind blow. He rained meat down on them like dust, birds like sand on the seashore. He made them come down inside their camp, all around their tents. They ate till they were gorged. He had given them what they craved. But before they turned from what they craved, even while the food was still in their mouths, God's anger rose against them. He put to death the sturdiest among them, cutting down the young men of Israel. In spite of all this, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. So he ended their days in futility and their years in terror. Whenever God slew them, they would seek him. They eagerly turned to him again. They remembered that God was their rock, that God Most High was their Redeemer. But then they would flatter him with their mouths, lying to him with their tongues. Their hearts were not loyal to him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities and did not destroy them. Time after time, he restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the wasteland. Again and again, they put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power, the day he redeemed them from the oppressor, the day he displayed his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the region of Zoan. He turned their river into blood. They could not drink from their streams. He sent swarms of flies that devoured them and frogs that devastated them. He gave their crops to the grasshopper, their produce to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamore figs with sleet. He gave over their cattle to the hail, their livestock to bolts of lightning. He unleashed against them his hot anger, his wrath, indignation, and hostility, a band of destroying angels. He prepared a path for his anger, but he did not spare them from death, but gave them over to the plague. He struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, the firstfruits of manhood, in the tents of Ham. But he brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely so that they were unafraid, but the sea engulfed their enemies. And so he brought them to the border of his holy land, to the hill country his right hand had taken. He drove out nations before them and allotted their lands to them as an inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their homes. But they put God to the test and rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. Like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. They angered him with their high places. They aroused his jealousy with their idols. When God heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among humans. He sent the ark of his might into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy. He gave his people over to the sword. He was furious with his inheritance. Fire consumed their young men, and their young women had no wedding songs. Their priests were put to the sword, and their widows could not weep. Then the Lord awoke as from a sleep, as a warrior wakes from the stupor of wine. He beat back his enemies. He put them to everlasting shame. Then he rejected the tents of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. He built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth that he established forever. He chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart. With skillful hands, he led them. And that is Psalm 78. So what can we learn in this psalm around the context of those verses 4, 5, and 6? What can we learn in the context that might help us as we are so concerned about seeing our grandchildren and future generations follow God? Well, I've already shown these, but remember there were 3 parts. And all of this is from verse 8 on, is recounting the history of Israel, their ancestors, how stubborn and rebellious they were, whose hearts were not loyal to God and whose spirits were not faithful to him. And 3 specific sections. But in those sections, there are some themes. And one of the themes, you probably caught this really quick, and that this whole chapter is so much about the failure of the ancestors. And I just want to list them for you real quick. This kind of gets overwhelming. But he says they were stubborn, rebellious, hearts not loyal, spirits were not faithful, did not keep God's covenant, refused to live by his law, forgot what he had done, continued to sin, rebelled, put God to the test, spoke against God, did not believe God or trust him, kept sinning, did not believe. You know how it is where we talk about today, when we critique somebody or something, if we say 10 good things about them and 1 bad thing, they're going to remember the bad thing, not the 10 good things. Well, this is quite a list of bad things, He's not saying it, of course, to the people because they were dead, but he's telling the people that were alive at his time. It goes on flattering him with their mouths. They lied to him. Their hearts weren't loyal. They didn't keep his covenant. They rebelled. They grieved his heart. They put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One, did not remember, put God to the test and rebelled, did not keep his statutes, were disloyal and faithless, and angered God. Altogether, I found those 27 things that had to do with the failures of the ancestors of Israel. So what can we learn from that? I think he's giving a very stern warning to the people in his generation of the dangers of disobedience and the dangers of failing. But a second theme that's a part of this, of course, was God's provision. Among all the failures that he talked about, he's also reminding the people of God's provision and God's patience and his judgment and his shepherding. 4 things that he reminds them about God. Each time, though, there's kind of a caveat. So he reminds them of God's provision, but then says Israel kept forgetting about God's provision. He reminds them of God's patience, but says, but Israel tested God's patience. He tells them of God's judgment, and then would say, well, Israel repented, but not sincerely, and then they would forget and fall back into the same pattern. And of course, we really see that during the time of the judges. And then he ends by talking about God's shepherding, even bringing the shepherd, David, to become their human shepherd as God was their eternal, all-knowing spiritual shepherd. So there are those 2 themes throughout the verse. And then we go back to verse 4. And I want you to see the things that he told them. These are the action steps in the chapter, Psalm 78. He begins this part by saying, we will not hide them from their descendants. And when I first read this chapter and was really beginning to study it, I wondered, well, not hide what? Not hide what? And then you look at the whole chapter, and it's very apparent what he's saying. We're not going to hide. We're not going to hide all the failures. We're not going to hide all the times that our ancestors didn't do things right. I don't know about you, but I think probably in most of our family lines, if we dig back in our ancestral history, we'll find somebody that was a horse thief or a bootlegger or a criminal of one sort or another. And, maybe we can joke a little bit about that, but we tend to want to hide those things. We tend to want to say, we came from a good line. We have good ancestors. Well, he's saying, we're not going to hide them. We're going to tell the truth about our ancestors and what all they did. The second thing that he says is, we will tell the next generation. And it's interesting that what he says we're going to tell them, excuse me, what he says we're going to tell them has to do with the character and the works of God. Those are the very things that generation in Judges chapter 2 didn't know about. But he says here, we're going to tell them. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. This verse is in direct contrast to Judges chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, where that generation didn't know the Lord or the things that he had done. And Asaph here says, we're going to tell them. We're going to make sure that they know. And then he says, he commanded our ancestors in verses 5 and 6. He commanded our ancestors to teach their children. To teach them what? Well, in between, he talks about the statutes and the laws of the Lord, the commandments of the Lord. And he says, in other words, the words of God. He said, we commanded our ancestors to teach their children. Why? So the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. Oh my, if that first generation, that Joshua generation, had that thought as when they were alive. But Asaph says here, he commanded our ancestors. That's the first generation. To teach their children, that's the second. So the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Now, if you put this back against what we talked about last week about the different generations. When he says he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, do you know that that actually was the Joshua generation that he's talking about here? Because Deuteronomy chapters 4 and 6 and 11 in particular talk about passing on faith and teaching younger generations about the things of God. That book of Deuteronomy records what Moses was saying to the children of Israel. So Joshua and the elders that were his contemporaries would have been there in the audience when Moses says those things. And so Asaph is recording that, or he's reporting that, and he says he commanded our ancestors, Joshua and all those guys, to teach their children so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. And that phrase right there is talking about that third generation that we've been so concerned about. And then look what it says. And they in turn would tell their children, and there would be a pattern of perpetuating faith if in fact this was carried out. That's what Asaph is saying. Look, we need to be thinking about perpetuating faith. So as we look at this, then let's become practical here, and let me kind of bring it home with some practical thoughts. But for every single one of us, here's the question: how can you perpetuate faith in your family? Well, we already said that there's no guarantees, because becoming a Christ follower is a personal decision. Nobody is a Christ follower because their parents were. Well, they may have been influenced, but just because your parents is a Christ follower and a Christian, a believer in Jesus, doesn't automatically make you one. And so we realize that it's a decision, but how can we do everything we can to perpetuate faith in our family? I have the little arrow there. So when we talk about family, we're not just talking about you and your children. We're talking about your grandchildren, but then how about the generations that follow them? How about your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren? What can you do to perpetuate faith as much as you possibly can to all the generations that follow you in your family line? Well, I have some suggestions for you that I think are based upon Psalm 78. Number one, have a 100-year vision. Can you do that? Can you think ahead to 21, 23? And think, what might I do that would impact my family in 21, 23? Remember that right now, the average age of a grandparent, average age when a person becomes a grandparent, is just a little short of 50, just right around 50. So let's use 50 as a round number. So when you talk about great-great-grandchildren, that's grandchildren of your grandchildren. So there's 50 plus 50 there. That's a 100-year vision, thinking 4 generations out. How do we do that? Well, we do what we can to prepare our grandchildren and give them a vision for being the same kind of grandparents that we desire to be. So having that 100-year vision is really important. Then the second thing that we need to do is we need to understand God's stated process for this. God's pattern is really, really clear. It's spelled out for us in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So clear: teach your children and your children's children. We have to stop as Christians in America and in other countries probably as well, of relying on the church alone to do the spiritual training of our children. We have to understand that children are going to be mostly influenced by what happens in the home, not by what happens at church. And one of the reasons why the church isn't able to do that so effective is because the average child doesn't go to church that often. Even the average church-going child doesn't go to church that often, to where the church has a real significant impact. So parents and grandparents have to step it up, and they have to do what God said all along. They have to be the ones to pass on faith to their children. And so we need to understand that. And And we can ask the question how, but it begins by understanding, yes, we are the ones who are responsible. Parents first, but grandparents right behind them in passing on faith. And then the third thing that we need to do is if we're going to tell stories, we have to identify what they are. I've shared before on Grand Monday nights and many times when I speak, I know absolutely nothing of the life of my great grandfather. I think that he might have been a believer. There are some indications to that, but I don't really know anything about his life and about his faith walk. And so I can tell the stories of the Bible, but if I'm to tell the stories in my family line of my ancestors and their faith walk, I've got almost nothing. I do for my dad, of course, and a little bit for my grandfather because they were alive and I knew them. But from beyond that, I don't have any stories. I've got nothing to share. And so if we have that vision for generations out into the future, we have to start thinking about, so what faith stories are we going to tell? What's the faith stories are we going to pass on to future generations? Because stories are powerful. And stories, especially by the people you love, are especially powerful. So it's really critical that we have faith stories to pass on. Let me give you a list, just real quick. I'm just going to go through these. And if you can't get them all down, if this list would be helpful to you, well, watch the replay in a day or two and you'll get those. But how about this? When you were saved, have you shared with your grandchildren when you were saved? I want my grandkids to be able to tell me back when I was saved. And same thing with my wife, Diane. We want them to know that. Second one, when you knew God was real, that may be the same point in your life. It may be a different point when you knew God was real. How about your only God moments? You know what I mean? Those things that happened, you said, wow, is only God. Maybe it was this incredible circumstance that happened, but whatever it was, your only God moments, those are things that you need to be able to share with your descendants. Your best spiritual decisions. When were the times that because of your belief in God, you made some decisions that really had a good impact on your life? Life challenges that helped your faith. Oh, that's important. I went through a time of severe illness in my late 30s and early 40s and really was struggling a whole lot. And yet that challenge of life, of a physical ailment, was a time that I grew almost the most spiritually. And that's almost always the case. And we need to share those with our grandkids. And then a failure and how God used it. You don't tell a 5-year-old probably about your failures, but with teenagers, you probably do. They probably need to know that grandpa and grandma blew it a few times, and they need to know that you recovered from that. There's an important time to share your failure, but they're a very, very important part. And remember that in Psalm 78, those failures are right out there in front from the failures of the children of Israel for everybody to see. People who impacted you spiritually, the Bible story you love the most, your life verse if you have one. So there are lots of things that you can share in regard to your life story. And then I would say this, get those stories memorialized. If you don't write them down, if you don't record them in some way, if you don't put them in a book, if you don't put them on a video, if you don't make an audio of those things, then very likely those stories will not be passed on. And your grandchildren, when they become adults, will not pass on stories to their children and grandchildren. You have to memorialize the stories in one way or another in order for them to be able to be passed on. Those are some things that you can do from Psalm 78. That's what this passage tells us and is a reminder of it. I think that Asaph would say, these are the things that went so wrong during the Judges. That generation of Joshua didn't pass it on like they should have. Even though they were a godly generation, even though they did many things right, They didn't pass it on the way that they should have. And that's the reason that 2 generations later, they had a generation that didn't know God, nor nor had not known of the things that God had done. Well, our pre-session guest tonight said this, and I want to say it again, but the motivation for all this for me is this simple little phrase right here, this simple little phrase. I want my grandkids in heaven with me. As I realize that life is short, the more that I realize that, isn't that true? The older we get, the shorter, the more we realize that life is short, then the more I look forward to eternity. And so if my vision for my family, for my grandkids is in this life only, I'm a sorry case of a Christian. So I want to have this be a driving force in my life, and it is. I want my grandkids in heaven with me. Do you? Do you want to have those great grandchildren that you will never meet on this earth? Wouldn't it be awesome to be able to have them walk up and introduce themselves to you someday in eternity? Wouldn't that be incredible to have that happen? So let's do all we can. Let's learn a lesson from the failure of Judges and then the advice of Asa. Let's pass on our family stories. Let's be intentional about sharing our faith stories, about investing in their lives and investing in their future. Let's follow the principles of Scripture.